All right, we're going to get started now. So to begin this evening, thank you again for joining us. We're really excited to talk with you about the city's budget and to provide an overview of some of the city's finances and the ways that budgeting decisions are made here in El Cerrito. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. So a brief overview of today's program. We're going to talk a little bit about city services and finances. We're also going to talk about the budget process to date, timeline and next steps. And then we have two different feedback and input activities, one that talks about difficult trade-offs and considerations, and the other one that asks you to help us by providing your priorities and helping prioritize different service areas that are top of mind. Again, we really encourage questions during this, so please use that question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom. I may not see all of your questions immediately, but our excellent finance director, Crystal Reams, is also here and is able to answer questions as we go. So we may hold some of them until that section of the presentation, and then we'll also try to answer a lot of them as we go. So about this webinar, so this is a presentation with some surveys and a Q&A opportunity. There is not planned time for open public comment today. This meeting is being recorded, so if you find it useful, please feel free to share that recording with anybody who you think may enjoy it. We're going to be posting this on the city's website so that it can be seen by other people in the future as well. Like I said, we encourage questions during this presentation. It helps me know what is of interest, what may or may not have been clear. So please feel free to use that question and answer function, and we'll try to get to those in a timely manner. Additionally, closed captions are enabled. So if you want to use those, you can see the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. And so that will enable you to see those automatically generated captions. So they're created automatically by Zoom. So occasionally maybe a few words off, but if those are helpful, we encourage you to use those as well. So to begin, we're going to talk a bit about the City of El Cerrito's finances. So the primary reason we're here is, of course, because we are in the midst of the annual budget process. Now, El Cerrito actually has a biennial budget, which means that every 2 years we go through the full budget development process, and then we do mid-cycle updates every year. So the annual budget runs from our fiscal year, which is July 1st to June 30th, and that's the same as most public agencies in California. And the budget determines all of the public services and programs that are funded for those 2 fiscal years. And these programs support the city's mission, vision, and values. And the budget document serves not only as the financial communication device, but also the planning document for work plans, the operations guide, and it's really a way to show the community and explain what types of work we do here at the city and the way that our community's values are set forth in our budget through the city. There is a famous quote that's been attributed to many different people, but this idea that a budget is a reflection of a community's values, and that's really important also in El Cerrito, is that our budget determines what services and programs we do, which are inherently tied to our mission, vision, and values. So a bit about municipal finance. El Cerrito has a lot of different types of funds, and these are basically the buckets that we put different types of money into. So in the general fund, that supports general government functions, and that's with unrestricted dollars. Those are typically tax dollars, and I'll speak about some of the specific types of things in the general fund on the next slide. But the general fund is unrestricted dollars, so those primarily are dollars that can be used for any purpose. And there are also some charges for services that are restricted to specific programs within the general fund. We talk mostly about the general fund because in El Cerrito, that's about $54 million of our $75 to $80 million total budget citywide. So it is the vast majority of El Cerrito's budget. We also have special revenue funds, and those are funds that are restricted for a specific program or use. So for example, we have a gas tax fund. So all of the gas taxes that are given to El Cerrito from the state of California are used for streets and roads related programs. El Cerrito does not have any discretion in how those are used. They must be used for the allowable purposes as stated in state law. And so we put them in a special fund to make sure that we can track and ensure that all of those special funds are used for the appropriate purposes. So you'll see a lot of special revenue funds in our budget, and those are all of the different designated funding sources that we track very intentionally. We also have an enterprise fund. Now that is the closest thing that a city might have to a business. They're considered self-supporting funds, self-supporting activities. So that's something like in El Cerrito, it's our recycling division or recycling department. You also might see something like a utility being an enterprise fund, and that's where the fees and the charges charged to the users are fully funding the full costs of that fund. So that's the Integrated Waste Management Fund. That's our recycling department. and that is fully supported by the user charges for the city's solid waste and recycling program. Other types of funds that the city has are things like capital funds for capital projects. We have debt service funds for major things like city hall debt and other forms of debt that the city has. We have internal service funds. You may hear a lot of talk about internal service funds, especially this year in this budget cycle, because the city and staff in the finance department are really trying to make sure that we're setting aside dollars over time for major expenses that we know are coming up. So internal service funds are a way that we can set aside money over time so that when we have this large purchase come up, we're ready to do so. So some examples of that might be a vehicle and equipment replacement internal service fund. So for example, a fire engine, you might set aside $100,000 a year for 10 years and then have $1 million available to pay for a new fire engine. You also see that with technology. Sometimes things like our financial software can be incredibly expensive to replace. And so we want to prepare for that by setting aside funds over time. So that's what we use internal service funds for. We also have some custodial funds. The city no longer has a pension trust fund because, we no longer have an other post-employment benefits. This says our pension trust fund is no longer in use. That's an error. Our pension trust fund is very much in use. We have a Section 115 pension trust, but we do not, we're currently in the process of dissolving our successor agency fund. So on the city revenue side, oh yes, and Crystal just sent me a note to remind me. So the pension trust fund is considered a part of the general fund. So it's a sub fund, so it's a little complicated in how you'll see it within our financials. But our pension trust is within is considered a component unit of the general fund. So in city revenues, this is a graph that shows the general fund revenues for the city. So this does not include the special revenue funds that I mentioned on the previous slide or the enterprise fund that we have. But for the general fund, for the current fiscal year that we're in, which is fiscal year 25-26, El Cerrito has an amended budget for revenues of $53.8 million and expenditures of $54.7 million. I mentioned before that El Cerrito is on a July 1 to June 30th fiscal year. And amendments to the budget are usually adopted by council at mid-year, although there are occasionally updates made throughout the year. As you can see, property taxes are the largest portion of El Cerrito's revenue, and that's 34%. These two different forms of sales tax, Measure R and the regular sales tax line, which is also called the Bradley-Burns 1% sales tax, those are both different forms of sales taxes, and those constitute 18% of the city's budget. And then in the other revenue category, that includes things like business licenses, parking citation fines, hotel taxes, cannabis revenue, and interest income that the city receives on its investments. On the taxes side, so taxes are charges for public services and facilities that do not have a direct relationship between the services used and the tax paid. So when you think about things that are funded by taxes, they're things that economists will often talk about market failures, things that maybe wouldn't be provided as much because they benefit everybody, but they may not have a very clear individual benefit that you would specifically pay for the way you might pay for maybe dinner somewhere and you get that specific individual benefit. A tax is something that will fund something with general benefit, whether that's education, whether that's public safety. Those taxes go to things that we believe that as a society and as a city benefit everybody and are worthwhile and important to have in a community. In California, all taxes require voter approval to establish or increase. So if a tax already exists, it can be decreased without voter approval, but it cannot be increased or expanded in base without voter approval. And that's a result, especially of Proposition 13. There are a lot of different taxes that fund the city of El Cerrito, and those include property taxes, real property transfer tax, parcel taxes, utility users taxes, sales and use taxes, transactions and use taxes, which are very similar to a sales tax, but there are some really nerdy little nuances that make it slightly different. I won't get into those today. If anyone ever wants to get really detailed, there's all kinds of great information that I can share and resources to direct you to about the difference between the types of sales taxes. But for most purposes, we talk about transactions and use taxes and sales and use taxes as the same thing. We also have a business license and operations tax. And the city does have a transient occupancy tax, which is often called a hotel tax. In California, general taxes require a 50% voter approval threshold. Those taxes are unrestricted in purpose, so those go into the general fund, and they can be used for really any governmental purpose. Special taxes with a specific purpose need 2/3 majority vote. And they must be set aside separately. So, for example, the city of El Cerrito has a special transactions and use tax that is reserved for streets and roads. That is not included in the general fund. That is entirely separate, and that is in a separate fund, also separate from the gas tax fund, but used for streets and roads. So that's, I believe, Measure A, which is set aside on its own. There's a nuance to the special tax law now, which is as of 2017, the California State Supreme Court, in a court case that's called the Upland decision, determined that special purpose taxes put onto the ballot by Citizens Initiative are eligible under the 50% approval threshold. So, for example, there's a library initiative that was recently put onto the ballot. That would be a 50% plus one voter approval threshold because it is a special tax put on by Citizens Initiative. But if it is a special purpose tax put on in any other mechanism, it requires 2/3 approval. Debt issuance, like general obligation bonds for cities in California, require 2/3 approval. Some of you may be thinking, wait, I thought general obligation bonds or debt requires 55%, but that is only for school districts. So in 2000, California voters approved Proposition 39, which allows school districts to pass new debt with 55% voter approval. There have been attempts to do that for cities in California, for example, Proposition 5 in 2024, if some of you may recall, but that initiative ultimately failed. And so cities still have the 2/3 approval requirement for issuing debt as well. So property taxes. Property taxes are, as I mentioned, 34% of El Cerrito's general fund. So they are the largest component of El Cerrito's revenues. Additionally, by Proposition 13, it not only changed voter approval thresholds, it also most famously set property taxes as 1% of assessed value at the time of sale. And then property taxes can increase by 2% or CPI, which is inflation, annually, whichever one is lower. Most years it has been by 2%. I believe I can't remember off the top of my head, in the last 8 years, there was 1 year where it was lower. But most years it does increase by that 2%. It's then allocated among a lot of different public agencies, and that allocation is very complicated and it is entirely separate city by city. The amount of property tax that a city receives is primarily determined by how much that city received when Proposition 13 was implemented, and it was implemented by the state legislature through what was called AB 8 way back in the 1970s. And when that implementation occurred, what existed then is very similar and really primarily determined what we have now. So cities like El Cerrito, who already had some form of locally adopted property tax, now receive a higher proportion of the property tax than many of our peers. We have one of the highest property tax apportionment rates in the region, and I believe in the state. And that is partially because El Cerrito voters, when Prop 13 had passed, had already approved additional property taxes locally. Now, property tax apportionment is also directly related to the services that cities have. Not all service responsibilities are equal. Some cities receive revenue and pay for the service directly. Some cities don't receive the revenue, and the service is entirely provided by a different public agency. I'm going to speak more to that on a different slide, so I'll pause there. But I'm going to go ahead and continue. I'm going to check our Q&A. I don't see any questions yet, so please feel free to put those in the chat if you have any questions. Thank you. So fees and other revenues. I talked for a moment there about taxes, which do not have a specific relationship to the amount of service received by the payer. Fees, on the other hand, do. Fees are charges that are imposed on an individual for a service that the person chooses to receive. And many fees in California, by Proposition 218 and 26 in particular, are limited to the estimated reasonable cost of providing the service or product for which the fee is charged, plus allowable administrative overhead. So what that means is there are some fees that cities charge that cannot be higher than the cost of providing the service that you are paying for. So some of those include building and planning permits in particular. And there are a number of different fees that are limited to what we call cost recovery basis. All of the city's fees, regardless of whether they're limited to cost recovery, are set by the city's master fee schedule. The city updates the master fee schedule and it is approved by council on an annual basis. The other types of fees that are not necessarily limited to cost recovery are things like rents for public property, recreation classes, and a number of other things that are specifically allowed to be at market rates rather than limited to the cost of providing the service. Within the city of El Cerrito, there are a couple of other types of revenue, and those are rents, franchises, investment earnings, proceeds from debt financing, and fines and penalties. So a lot of different types of revenues, but the primary ones that you'll hear us talking about in particular are taxes and fees. So a bit about city services. El Cerrito is what is considered a full service city. You'll sometimes hear us use that phrase, and that's because El Cerrito provides all of the core city services in-house. Not only do we have the service responsibility, we actually do it ourselves. So we have our own fire department, our own police department, our own rec, our own public works, building and planning, economic development, and administration. Every city in California has a slightly different portfolio of services. They do all kinds of different things, whether that's city operated utilities, housing authorities. There's a huge variety of different things that cities do. There's actually 4 cities in California who have health departments, and every other health department is provided by the county, but there are 4. Now, that does include the city and county of San Francisco, so they are a county as well. But there are 3 other cities that actually have health departments in the city, in addition to the one at the county level. So there's all kinds of different things that a city can provide. And one of the things that determines is the size of the budget. And that's why we talk about the services so much, because the services determine the budget. Obviously, you can imagine the things that we provide have certain costs. And so when you think about different cities, it's very, very difficult and almost impossible to compare cities. Every city is unique in the services that we provide and the communities that we serve. We have differences in geography. You can imagine the differences between maybe a Central Valley city that's very flat and a city like El Cerrito, which has a significant portion in the hillside with potential fire risk as a result. You can imagine cities on the coast, maybe like Monterey, has a very different city experience than somewhere like Sacramento. They're very different in geography, and that determines a lot of city services. You have a different business environment and amenities. Cities like Anaheim, with a very large and very famous employer and very famous draw, you're going to see a very different body of city services provided and the revenues that they have and the types of revenues that they charge. For example, the city of Anaheim, their transient occupancy tax, their hotel tax, is an enormous, I would think it's 50% of their budget. It is incredibly high. Whereas a city like El Cerrito has very few hotels and a smaller tourist community. And so that's why our budgets are going to look different, because we have different business environments and different amenities provided within the city. We have different community demographics, different economic demographics. There's different revenue portfolios, and some of that has a lot to do with the community and what they choose to pay for. Locally adopted taxes, fee structures, major employers, major businesses, like I mentioned. And one of the core ones is service responsibilities. I mentioned this on the property tax apportionment side, but there are 3 primary ways that a service can be provided, and that is what a city service can be provided. Now, that is in-house, where the city receives the revenue and then pays for the service and then provides the service itself. So El Cerrito receives the portion of the property tax for fire services, and we do the fire service ourselves. There are some cities, the second option is contracting out, and that is where a city might receive the property tax for fire service, but instead of having their own fire department, they pay the county or they pay a special district. So they get the money, but then they pay that to another. So that's something like Kensington, which is not an incorporated city, but the residents there said that they have that property tax dollars and they want to choose and pay that money to the El Cerrito Fire Department to provide that service. The final option or possible way to provide that service is that a city sometimes does not have the service responsibility whatsoever. And what that means is they don't get the portion of the property tax, they don't pay anything for it, and those services are provided by an entirely different public agency, and that's codified in some that's codified in law. So, for example, one of our neighboring cities nearby receives 5.5% of the property tax. El Cerrito receives over 22% of the property tax. It seems very different. But Hercules doesn't provide fire services. There's a special district that provide fire services. So it's not that they contract it out. They never even get the money to begin with. And so there's no right or wrong answer. There are many, many different ways that cities and counties provide public services. So it's not about right or wrong. It's just that they are fundamentally different. And so in my background, I used to do a lot of peer comparison studies for cities where you get lists of cities and you look at all the different ways that they do things. And in my opinion, the best, most valuable use of that information is to see what are cities doing well? how can El Cerrito look to our neighbors and learn great examples and opportunities for how we can improve and how we can do well, and how can we share our own best practices, but recognizing that at the end of the day, our communities are very different and they have different expectations of level of service. Because as I'm talking about the ways that we provide services, I haven't even touched on the level of service, which is that even two cities who look identical on paper and provide the same list of services, they may not even provide the same level of service. Now, whether that's public safety response times may not be the same, or whether that's the types of programs that the recreation department provides may not be the same. The level of service may not be identical either. So at the end of the day, it's okay that cities are different. And to me, it's the most important thing is to understand the values of El Cerrito, what our community wants, what our community expects, and what is the best way that we as a city can provide those services to El Cerrito. So talking about expenditures, these are two different graphs that show the same total money, but it's just the two different ways that we think about splitting up our expenditures. Now that is in type by type. And so you'll notice that personnel is the overwhelming majority of our costs. And that is because at the end of the day, people are services. So when you call the fire department, it's the firefighters who are driving the vehicle and who are showing up. When you go to the planning department, it's the people who are reviewing your applications. So ultimately, the people who are the staff of El Cerrito are the ones who are providing the services. If you look at the purchase professional and technical services and the purchase property services, those include critical needs. So those are things like our dispatch services contract. El Cerrito contracts with the city of Richmond to provide dispatch services rather than doing it in-house ourselves. Those are animal control services with Contra Costa County. They're building and planning services when there are permits and things that require more technical expertise or more complexity than our staff have capacity for. So there are a lot of different types of expenditures, but personnel is the bulk of our budget. And that's true of every city in California, except for those who contract out most of their services. So other those are the different types of services that we have. There's some for supplies, property, and capital. Then on the department side, this is the breakdown of expenses by department citywide. So there are a lot of different things. One thing that I will flag because it is about to be shifted a bit in the budget, within administration are very, very large expenses for citywide things like general liability insurance, which is about $1.5 million at this time. And so we're going to try to find ways to make sure that we are being fully transparent about all of the different costs and where they sit within the budget. And that's one of the things that we may be looking at in the next fiscal year, in the next 2-year budget, of how can we make sure that all of these different very large costs are communicated transparently. So as we're thinking about the budget, I want to share some major revenue and expense trends. The city is seeing modest but steady revenue growth. So some growth estimates that we have so far: property taxes, we expect to grow by 5%. And you may be saying, wait a second, Claire, you just told me that they could only grow by 2%. But that's because when properties are sold, they're reassessed at the new value. So as some of you may have seen, if there's somebody who's lived in their house for a very long time, for example, my parents bought their home in, I think, 1992. And the change in value in their house from when they bought it to now is pretty significant, especially for most people in California. So when that house is then resold, it is reassessed at that higher rate. And so that's the primary source of that additional 3% of growth, is from that reassessment. We're seeing about a 2% growth in sales taxes. El Cerrito has, for the last 2 years, outperformed state trends in sales taxes. Our local economy is doing very well, and so we are outperforming. We are not assuming that we will continue to outperform, but all of our expert consultants recommend and believe that the sales taxes will continue to rise at a modest rate of 2%, which is lower than we've seen in some years, but that's what's expected from the current economy. On the utility tax side, we're expecting utility taxes to increase by 4%. Now, as you can imagine, we also have higher utility bills that we pay, but that's primarily because of increases to PG&E and to water bills. Our telecom UUT and utility taxes, I call that UUT, utility users tax. Utility taxes for telecom, for cable, have been declining steadily. And so, we're seeing we're seeing utility taxes increase from energy and water and then decrease from telecom. And the net impact of that is 4%. Fees will increase by either CPI or actual cost, which will depend during the analysis of our master fee schedule, which will go to council at the end of May. And as I noted, they're limited to cost recovery basis, and the city did a new cost allocation plan and master fee schedule recently. On the expenditure side, costs are increasing very rapidly. We are seeing huge cost increases in areas where the city does not have control. Things like general liability and workers' compensation insurance are increasing by 18% or more annually. So they, in the last 5 years, have gone from $500,000 to $1.5 million. They are increasing incredibly quickly. We're expecting medical benefit costs to go up very significantly as well. And overall inflationary costs are affecting the city's expenses in particular. We also signed new labor contracts as a result of the city's classification and compensation study. And so we're seeing some pretty significant increases also from the new labor contracts. Pension costs are increasing. They are increasing as expected. We receive our CalPERS reports annually, and we track those very carefully. I'm going to speak a little bit more to pension costs here on this next slide, which is to talk about the rate of growth. So as you can see, our pension funding status is projected to increase steadily and then plateau at 100%. And at the same time, that our combined employer rate is coming down. Now, what that means is we're getting to a point where we're getting to what I will call peak UAL, and UAL stands for unfunded actuarial liability. So many of you have seen this pension graph, which looks like a big curve. And what's happening is that in 2013, the state passed the Public Employee Pension Reform Act, which is called PEPRA. And that curve is seeing the impact of that as employees retire and more of the workforce are on this new PEPRA plan. The long-term costs to the city do start to decline. So the city council has taken proactive action to ensure fiscal sustainability. And that was through establishing the city's Section 115 pension trust that I mentioned earlier. And that's a set aside of dollars to help the city pay for its long-term pension obligations. So it was established in September of 2023, currently has $3 million, and it allows, it's an invested fund that allows for higher returns, and it allows advanced planning, but it also gives us flexibility. So one of the challenges with something like, they call it an ADP, an advanced discretionary payment. So that's basically paying an extra portion of your pension in advance. The challenge with that is it requires you to time the market, because you could put all those dollars in and then the markets do really poorly. And in a way, you've lost a lot of those dollars. The nice thing about a Section 115 trust is you can use it to pay that unfunded actuarial liability over time and help smooth those impacts to the city to make it so that the city has lower impact on the general fund over time. Staff evaluate prepaying our UAL annually. So we get a 3.3% discount for prepaying each year. So that is something that we can often do due to our cash flow and due to our robust reserves that the city has built up over the past 5 years. I want to touch on highlight some of the major capital and infrastructure projects. Yvette Ortiz, our excellent public works director, is always very busy and working on a lot of different things. So there are all kinds of things in progress right now, like swim center repairs, city council chambers, audio-visual improvements, the Del Norte Complete Streets project, annual street improvement programs, the Hillside Natural Area programs. Some of these are grant funded. Some of these are funded through state subventions, which are dollars given from the state or even federal government. Some of them are through general fund. So it just depends on the project. But the city has had some really great infrastructure funding from outside sources that have been helpful in making some really great headway on major capital projects. So talking about the general fund balance, the city has robust general fund reserves remaining after the mid-year adjustments. Now that includes the Emergency and Disaster Recovery Fund, which is funded at $7.5 million. The policy level for that is that it be 13% of expenditures, and that $7.5 million is actually above the city, that 13% policy threshold right now. The general fund reserve of $9.3 million, which is the policy level of 17% of budgeted general fund expenditures. And then the Section 115 pension trust of $3 million. There's an additional remaining unassigned fund balance of $2.7 million. So that's a total reserve level right now of $22.6 million. We often talk about our general fund forecast and talk about our long-term fiscal health. We have a general fund forecast that we update frequently, and that's based on the current budget year. And then we have assumptions for long-term growth, and that's based on historic and current trends. Our expenditure growth assumptions in this model include existing employment agreements, conservative but reasonable expenditure growth. It includes existing debt obligations. It includes the CalPERS actuarial estimates. So directly from CalPERS, they have very robust staff of very, very qualified experts. So we use their numbers for the actuarial estimates. And then it also includes use of the Section 115 trust to smooth the anticipated costs at the peak point of the pension. So if you look at the graph on the right, the green section, you see the green section, the gray section, and the blue. The blue is the Emergency Disaster Recovery Fund, EDRF, and that's that $7.5 million that I mentioned before. You also have the gray, which is the Section 115 pension trust. And so you see that continuing to grow for a bit, and then you see it start to decline right when there's that peak pension, when the actuarial analysis shows that we're going to have the highest pension contributions. That's when the Section 115 trust starts to go down, because it presumably could be used by the city council to smooth that. Now, that would be a council policy decision, but that is the current projection in the forecast. So as you can see, the current forecast shows declining unrestricted revenues and then recovering in the out years. And that is due to both concluding debt service obligations, but especially due to improvements in the city's UAL as PEPRA goes into effect. This, again, assumes the current fiscal year. It assumes no budget changes or corrections in future years. And so I want to emphasize that this forecast is a point in time. This is what this looks like today with the information we currently have available and what could potentially happen if no changes were made. But staff are in the process of developing the new budget. Staff have been directed to present a balanced budget to council, and we intend to do so. And so what you see in the 26-27 year, and let me see if I have a little pointer. I don't think I do. Too bad. You can see the 26-27 budget year starts to go down. It starts to dip below that reserve goal. But that would only occur if the city council adopted a deficit budget. And so what this is if nothing changed. But as staff, we are working very hard to identify budget solutions to make sure that the city can be fiscally sustainable for the long term. Do a quick check. All right. So a reminder of the current two-year budget process to date. We have had a few different council meetings and community workshops so far. We also have a community survey in progress, and that's going to close on March 31st, which is in just a few days. So please encourage your friends and community members and neighbors to take that survey. Finance is developing revenue and non-discretionary expenditure estimates. So we are building the budget, and departments are developing their budgets and providing programmatic information to finance and to the city manager's office to then develop the recommendations and the information to be presented to council. A little bit about how we develop the budget. So we use the city's strategic plan as the guidelines for how we do the budget. So we make sure that the budget and services are aligned with the strategic plan. Our goal is to ensure fiscal sustainability and meet our reserve goals, and a biennial budget allows us to do that by taking a longer term approach. We make sure that we adhere to legal, policy, and program requirements. And one of the great things about a biennial budget, while it encompasses a 2-year plan, the city still legally and formally adopts the budget on an annual basis. So we do all of the work to create a 2-year budget, but then the actual formal adoption occurs each year in June. And so if there are changes that need to be made, as happened, for example, in last year's mid-cycle adoption, there can be those adjustments made in the second year of the budget as well. These are some of the guiding principles that staff think about when developing the budget. So we think about fiscal sustainability, one city, one general fund, which means that the general fund is shared resources across all departments. And so we don't want turf wars or my money, my money. We want the whole city to think as one and to think as one general fund. We aim for full transparency to provide the council, the city manager, finance, and the public to buy a laptop and buy fewer pencils. They have the discretion to do that. They can move spending among line items they can move spending among line items, but as long as they stay within their department or division budget. We also try to get complete budgets during the annual budget process. So avoiding off-cycle amendments if at all possible, especially for ongoing expenses. We know that emergencies happen and that things come up, but for ongoing operational budgeting, we really try to keep that within the annual budget process. And then finally, planning and preparing for long-term needs. At the beginning, I mentioned internal service funds, and it is really our goal to make sure that we are setting aside funds and having asset replacement plans to prepare for our long-term needs. Brief review of the strategic plan. There are 5 core tenets of the strategic plan: high-performing organization, community safety, livability and belonging, infrastructure and amenities, and environmental sustainability. The full detail of the city's strategic plan is available on the city website, so I encourage you to look at that strategic plan if you're ever curious about the goals and the guidance that is provided to staff as we look at our budget and services. This is to reiterate the strategic plan. We mirror the adopted strategic plan, and we also had the City Council confirm that at the budget kickoff priority setting workshop in January and reiterate their goals and priorities for the year. So finally, these are the next steps in the budget process. We have this virtual workshop today. We will also have a council study session on April 21st, another one on May 5th, and then the City Council will consider the budget for adoption on June 2nd and June 16th. Those will be the final adoption discussions. The goal is to adopt the budget by June 30th so that we have it ready to go on July 1st. These dates may adjust a little bit, but those are the current plans and the next steps for the city budget. And with that, that concludes the presentation portion of this workshop. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop the recording here.